Well, today we're looking at everything over, this is hard to do, over here. Uh, America and the world on the foreign policy side. Right? 1898 to the 1930s, specifically trying to find out how America became an imperial power, how millions of former Spanish subjects end up under American control. And that's in Cuba and Puerto Rico, close to home, but also in the Pacific. And all starting with war in Cuba, 1898. Now, this phrase, a splendid little war, is a famous quote attributed to John Hay. And he's talking about the Spanish-American War in a letter to Teddy Roosevelt. And there's a segue from Roosevelt to this lecture. And so, yeah, describing the conflict kind of as it is, a short, relatively painless for the United States with massive benefits. Now, no war is really splendid, and 4,000 Americans are killed in this war, so obviously their families would beg to differ. But in any case, it is a very short conflict which has huge ramifications. Making America into imperial power, and which obviously is anathema to what America was supposed to be about as a born in a revolution against imperialism, against empire, and always steadfastly holding to that, and not a little bit of propaganda is needed to make it look like America is not an imperialist in the sense that the Europeans are. Okay, so we'll look at that as well. Also, we look at American diplomacy in the Western Hemisphere in general after that war, and then how the Americans get into World War I in spite of being steadfastly committed against that. And then its legacy in that regard, World War I, and its retraction back into isolationism after the war. Okay, so buckle your seatbelts, that's the ride we're going on. Let's get started. Okay, and I'm going with the premise, of course, all historians, that nothing happens just like that. It's not like suddenly America's interested in Cuba and empire. America has long had involvement, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And it's been very intentional about that. Okay, this goes back to the Monroe Doctrine, at least, where basically President Monroe announces to Europeans that they cannot interfere any longer in the Western Hemisphere to recover old debts, to try and assert their hegemonies in ways that they used to. Now, this is post-revolutions. The big revolutions begin with Simon Bolivar in South America. These are all new republican countries in the Western Hemisphere, most of them. And so America is saying, hands off. There's no return to your old-style politics in this part of the world. It's our backyard, basically. Leave America for the Americans. Now, this is a doctrine announced in 1823, and it basically remains untouched into the 20th century. Now, adding to that, of course, is the doctrine of manifest destiny, which we've already talked about, and this is pre-Civil War, clearly, and it is that idea that American institutions are uniquely virtuous, and America has a duty to spread those institutions to places where that liberty is in short supply. And by the way, that comes from God himself, providence, right? So it is our destiny to spread liberty around the Western Hemisphere. And some saw that as every square inch from Tierra del Fuego up to Alaska. So the entire Western Hemisphere is what some are saying will become the American Republic, the United States. John O'Sullivan, who is the author of this particular piece of propaganda and manages to form a sectional alliance, or this idea forms a cross-sectional alliance between North and South of people that are excited at this idea. He himself is a good example of this kind of annexationist sentiment. While on his honeymoon, he's in Cuba and finds out that there's a peasant insurrection going on there. There's a planned revolt. There definitely is a movement against Spain, and he gets involved in a coup plot with Narciso Lopez. Narciso Lopez ends up being found out and is garroted, so executed. O'Sullivan walks away from that one. But in any case, this goes way back. David Walker is another one that he, with a couple hundred Americans, his own little army, invaded and liberated Nicaragua. Okay, and want to add it. It's the 1850s to America. In fact, they wanted to turn it into a slave state. In any case, this is not a new thing. Messing with Central America, and under the rhetoric of extending liberty always. Right. So how does push come to shove? Well, as they say, well, it begins under the presidency of President McKinley in the late 19th century. And we also can't talk about this without mentioning William Randolph Hearst, because he plays a pretty big role in this. Now, Hearst, this is fascinating stuff. He's a newspaper magnate with a big castle out in San Simeon, California, which you can visit to this day. It's a pretty cool spot. A very, very wealthy man who controls Hollywood, and he does that through, which is incidental to where we're going, but anyways, he does that through his 28 newspapers across the country, 20 magazines, very influential man whose goal is to become the President of the United States. If there's a prize, he wants it. If it was king, he'd go for that. A great movie about this time period, if you want, it's called Hearst and Pulitzer, The Battle Over Citizen Kane. So that's on YouTube. The full movie's on YouTube, and it's really good. It gives you a great sense of this time, and it talks about Orson Welles and how he made the movie Citizen Kane based not loosely enough, according to Hearst, on Hearst's own life, and it's a very unflattering one. And Hearst sees to it that Orson Welles' reputation is ruined, and the movie does not get exhibited. Becomes one of the most famous movies of the 20th century. But in any case, it is about William Randolph Hearst. Fascinating individual, and known for the term yellow journalism, which is basically tabloid journalism, sensational journalism, which is a new term of the time, and is really most associated with William Randolph Hearst, but also Joseph Pulitzer, who has the New York World. Where William Randolph Hearst has a New York Journal, Joseph Pulitzer, the Pulitzer Prize, has the New York World, and they both have sensational journalism, big screaming headlines, and a certain approach to the truth, as in it shouldn't get in the way of a good story. Now, and Hearst is famously known for promising to deliver Cuba and doing it through his newspapers to whip up fervor for that. We can't over-exaggerate that, or we can't exaggerate the extent of that, because it is, the old historiography said it was largely or almost exclusively William Hearst and Pulitzer's media that did this, but more careful studies suggest there's a lot more going on, and Americans were not that easily duped. But in any case, sensational journalism is tied into it, as is his ambition and ego to take the White House. The paradox being for Hearst, and this gets to later in the story, is that he's hoping to use the Spanish-American War as a way to catapult himself into the White House, but in his newspapers, they always getting out and out stupid in terms of their irresponsible journalism. At one point, his editor says that somebody should put a bullet in William McKinley, and then when somebody does, that's it for Hearst. He loses his political credos because of that, or his In any case, and Teddy Roosevelt ends up becoming the big hero of the Spanish-American War, who catapults that into a career in the White House. In any case, perhaps more than you want to know, but do watch that documentary if you're interested. Now, here's some examples here at the top of some of the yellow journalism that you find, the sensational headlines and the made-up propaganda from the Hearst side about what's going on in Spain. Now, all of this is in the context of another peasant rebellion, which has begun in 1895. So the Cubans, again, another independence movement starting in 1895. Now, in response to that, the Spanish have gotten pretty repressive, and what they've done is they come up with this reconcentration policy during this Cuban War of Independence, only the latest iteration of that. And that's basically forcibly relocating the rural Cuban population into designated concentration camps, or reconcentrados. That starts in 1896. They're trying to isolate the rebels from their support network and prevent them from accessing resources. But of course, maybe not of course, but in any case, inevitably it does result in widespread death and suffering because of disease and starvation in these camps. It's it's not the last time this will be tried. The British will try this later on in Kenya. But in any case, it's a brutal policy. So that's a part of the story that isn't often told, and that there is a Spanish repression here. Now, there's also a historiographical argument, or in the historiography on the Spanish-American War, there is an argument that Spain simply wanted out of Cuba, that it couldn't afford it. And that's certainly true. That's the Spanish Empire is in its declining days. It's Europe's oldest empire. And at one time controlled the entire Western Hemisphere, or almost the entire Western Hemisphere. Certainly, early days it did. But in any case, Spain is on its back feet at this point, and wanting out, does need to get out, and there is an argument that it's looking for an honorable way to do that without having civil war in Spain itself or a coup against the government, because it would be very unpopular to simply walk away. And so the Spanish-American War furnishes this opportunity. So there is that argument. But in any case, it's definitely being pushed from the American side, and the likes of Hearst and Pulitzer, and not a few Americans are in favor of action to liberate the Cubans. Now, the Americans have also been very involved in Cuba for a very long time at an economic level. So if you follow the money, you will say that this is an effort to make sure that America maintains its hegemony, its economic hegemony on this island. Okay, and that's been happening since Spain has opened it up to foreign intercourse since about, I think, 1818. And Americans have quickly dominated. 90% of Cuban products are sold in the U.S., and many Americans own sugar plantations there and other interests. Right? Now, war famously begins when, in a nutshell, when the U.S. sends a gunship to Havana to show the American flag and protect U.S. interests in context of this crisis that's developing there, right? This war for independence. 3 weeks there, and the ship explodes. 270 men, Americans, blow up with it and are killed. Now, the result is pretty predictable. The Americans blame the Spanish, and we get war fever. Right? Absent any evidence that Spain was involved. The papers report that 100% it was an explosion caused by a bomb or a torpedo from the Spanish. So this is the cause célèbre that starts the war. Whether it was, and you can read up on this very easily, but Commission later realizes or finds out that it was probably the boiler in the ship that caused it to explode. So a much more prosaic or a banal reason for it. But in any case, it does become the cause for war at this point. And I think the New York Journal goes to 10 editions that day. Okay, so war fervor is at a height, and volunteer militias are forming, including under Teddy Roosevelt, as we've talked about. Yeah, Roosevelt goes back to goes to San Antonio, gets together a bunch of his college friends and a bunch of Texan cowboys, and they meet there in the Davy Crockett Hotel right behind the Alamo, and they sail over to Cuba. This is how it works in this age of voluntary militias. Now they have their moment of fame in this famous charge up San Juan Hill in Cuba, which is an important turning point in the war. What's interesting about it is how it's remembered, or how it's depicted at the time by Americans and by Roosevelt himself. Now, what it has done with the U.S. colored troops, these colored regiments that had volunteered, and there's a truism about American war that they always forget that African Americans can fight, that volunteers sign up to fight and do quite heroically and effectively, and that's from Battle of Fort Wagner, and the Second Battle of Fort Wagner in the Civil War, right up until Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Tuskegee Flymen. But they're always this is always forgotten immediately when the guns go silent, and they're written out of the story, and that happens again here. And Teddy Roosevelt, in as much as you might have seen him as a bit of a hero from my previous lectures, this one will give you pause. He initially celebrates their involvement and kudos to them for their actions, heroic actions here, and later on throws them under the bus and says that they were cowardly and had to be pushed on by their white superiors. In any case, in the brag photo afterwards, there's no black faces. There's no Cuban faces either. And that's the other thing that's interesting, is that the charge up San Juan Hill, as with all these battles, was fought with Spanish soldiers as well. It's their fight, right? Now, the war lasts all of a few months, and then there is a 4-month negotiated truce, so it's all over by Christmas 1898. But Americans are having a good time here, and they do not want to leave. There's my little lame joke. But yeah, actually, the long game was to stick around. And so what we get is the Platt Amendment of 1901, which is this piece of U.S. legislation that is meant to define the relationship between the States and Cuba, but it's basically under the point of a gun, as in we will pull our troops out once you sign these 7 points at the end of the war. The conditions for the withdrawal of their troops. So 7 points are the most important, being it essentially gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, and it took away their right to negotiate with other nations without the U.S. Blessing. Also, the Americans could maintain naval bases on the islands. Plural, naval bases, plural. Cubans don't have much choice to sign, obviously, but from the outset, this is a major source of contention, resentment in Cuba, which builds up over the years, doesn't go away, contributes eventually to the Cuban Revolution in 1959. So if the long game was U.S. hegemony, it didn't work, but it did work in the short term. And by 1905, so less than 4 years after the Platt Amendment is signed, Americans now own an astonishing 60% of Cuba's land base. That's 13,000 North Americans and corporations. American sugar producers are a big component of this, and there's others like tobacco, as you probably can anticipate. Cuban cigars. In any case, U.S. economic interests, in other words, take over that area that the Spanish had, and they continued to dominate right up until Castro and Che Guevara. Even though they had already been there in a big way, now it's more than ever. And that revolution, of course, in 1959, Castro and Che Guevara, is largely a reaction to that domination. Now, interestingly, Castro was initially not a communist, even though he's heading in that direction, definitely a socialist. But it's the actions of the Americans boycotting him when his government expropriates land from the Americans in the revolution that starts to see him heading in that direction. So the nationalization of American-owned businesses and land it was a key part of the revolution's agenda, and for good reason. But U.S. sanctions and then boycotts and then a failed American CIA-backed invasion to try and overthrow Castro, which is the Bay of Pigs that we'll cover later, that all puts Castro firmly in the Soviet camp because he needs allies, and who better than America's most powerful enemy? So in any case, as you can see there on the bottom, FDR was more about good neighbor policy with Latin America, and he repeals the Platt Amendment, which was so offensive. So it's not like you could make a direct line from then to 1959, but did retain a naval base in Guantanamo. Meantime, if we go back to 1898, at the same time Americans are running around Cuba, the American Navy under Admiral Dewey is taking the Philippines, and does in the Battle of Manila. Yeah, and you heard me right, the Philippines. So it's a Spanish colony. We're at war with Spain, and A, it's a strategic location given the U.S. wants to expand trade with Asia, and B, they're not quite ready for independence. We need to prepare them for democratic rule via benevolent assimilation, which is McKinley's term. Basically, it is the white man's burden by a different name. It's exactly what you expect. Rationalization for maintaining occupation presence here. Any case, it's a very short battle because the Americans are the taking of the Philippines from Spain, because the Americans are assisted by the Filipinos under this gentleman here, Aguinaldo, and like the Cubans, they want freedom. So they are in the fight. But then just after the ink is dry on the treaty with Spain, the United States declares military rule. So it's clear they're not leaving. And hence the policy of benevolent assimilation and a military government. Now, and of course, now these same helpful Filipinos turn on the Americans, and under Aguinaldo we get a counterinsurgency war, and a pretty brutal one, shades of Vietnam here. Pacification of Samar is probably the worst. And here you have a General Jacob Smith who retaliates against a surprise attack on his men, in which Filipinos had killed about 50 of them. Retaliates by ordering everyone on that island over the age of 10 to be killed, and that's what that political anti-imperialist cartoon there is on the top right. So this order is given. It doesn't quite happen, but a few thousand are killed. Smith later is court-martialed, but yeah, many Filipinos many innocent civilians are caught up in this. Over 200,000 are that's the consensus. Filipinos say it's much higher. Are killed by U.S. Army that sees them as natives, and that's how they report on it. We killed these natives. In that way, it's much like the Indian Wars. It's also much like Vietnam, guerrilla counterinsurgency and mass civilian murders. One of the worst happens 6 years after the war ends, and that is against the Moro tribe that lives in the South Philippines, and this is called the Battle of Bagdajo, which in fact is not a battle at all. It's a massacre. Over 1,000 villagers are killed for their anti-American or anti-occupation activities here. So against the anti-imperialist, America has gone for what Roosevelt will call big stick diplomacy. Talk softly and carry a big stick, he famously says. The next president. And of course, we're only here temporarily, but temporary can last a long time. Cuba's given its independence, but its foreign affairs is controlled by the U.S., which keeps bases there. Philippines never quite ready for independence, really till after World War II. Now, to their immense credit, there is some benevolence here, and the U.S. does reform Filipino land law for massive benefit for the Filipinos. This land inequality and the latifundia system that the Spanish had was brutal for perpetuating poverty in every country that had been a Spanish colony. So land reform was always the big deal. And the Americans successfully do that there. They also established an education system. And eventually, by the 1930s, Americans are losing more money than they're really gaining from the Philippines. It's a bit of a trade deficit for them, or an investment deficit. And what we get is the Filipinos, who are so independence-minded, their politicians all benefit massively from American money. So they tend to, when running for elections, will talk about getting the Americans out, and then once they're in office, do nothing of the sort. In any case, the bigger point here, though, is that a page has been turned, and Americans start taking unilateral action to do what they need to do if it protects their interests. And in fact, they even codify that the essence of the Monroe Doctrine is extended into what's called the Roosevelt Corollary, which you should really look up and read the text of that. It's fascinating. And basically, it gives the U.S. the right to intervene in affairs of any small nation in the Western Hemisphere if those nations are at risk of being interfered with by European powers, and making it clear that they have no desire to do that, but they will. So, for example, if the Guatemalans owe the British millions of dollars, which they did, and if Britain makes moves to recover that, the Americans can read that as provocation in their sphere and intervene there instead. Protect the American hemisphere for American interests. So regional power broker here, the Americans are. And you'll see that many times, and it basically explains what happens for the next 100 years, up until Ronald Reagan anyway. 1950s in Guatemala is one of the best examples, where a democratically elected government under Arbenz is overthrown in a CIA coup after that government nationalized the United Fruit Company holdings, right? Follow the money. And so, and what we get in Guatemala is a right-wing dictatorship, known for human rights abuses that the Americans back. Same identical thing happens in Chile in the 1970s, where the democratically elected socialist government of Allende is overthrown in a coup, and we get the dictator Pinochet being backed by the U.S. And again, human rights abuses, but a friend of America. So this becomes the standard and common practice. In fact, here's a list of the interventions, the American interventions in Central and South America just in the years 1906 to 1920. It's fairly incredible. You can look at those in more detail if you want. Now, where you see the Roosevelt corollary at its most creative, arguably, is where Theodore Roosevelt himself plays a key role in gaining hegemony over Panama. Now, Panama was a province of Colombia, as you can see here in this bottom left map. It was kind of an unstable area that goes way back, but it's a land of bandits to the point piracy is so bad that shippers in the 18th century opted to go around Cape Horn instead, adding thousands of miles to their journey rather than going over the Isthmus of Panama. Americans long wanted assured access here. So in 1846, the U.S. government signed a treaty with Colombia whereby, in exchange for guaranteeing the sovereignty of Colombia, which they do, to this land, they get the right to build a railroad here. So U.S. investment completed in 1855, too late to help those California gold rushers, but important. And they really want a shipping canal here too, which is obviously important for your Navy. You've got a Pacific and Atlantic Navy. For them to operate in tandem, you need a canal. And so when Colombia rejected a treaty allowing the U.S. to build the Panama Canal, Roosevelt then supports a group of Panamanian separatists, so provincial separatists. He finances them, he equips them. At the same time, he uses the U.S. Navy to prevent Colombia from intervening here. And that's what enables the rebels to declare independence, Panamanian independence. And then, of course, under the U.S., they're granting the Americans all they want, including the rights to build the canal. And what's amazing is those rights were given in perpetuity. Okay? So, yeah, canal is built, and it is an amazing project. It's finished in 1914. Definitely a crowning achievement for TR, and a crowing achievement, I guess you could say, bragging rights. And America's really come of age here. And one thing is that the French had, this is what makes it so sweet for the Americans, the French had tried to build a canal here in the 1880s, but they'd given up when they were only 40% finished, and they sold their works and equipment to America at a huge loss. Also, a graveyard of their workers of 20,000 Frenchmen that died here, a lot of them from the colonies in Africa. Tragic. Mostly that's malaria, which the Americans managed to get on top of, not in a great environmental way. They basically oil all the lakes there to keep the mosquitoes down, because it's malaria that's killing everyone. But in any case, Colombia learns through all this that you can't trust the Americans. If it matters enough, they will rationalize taking it. But more broadly, it is a coming of age for America among world empires. Britain has their canal, now America does too. And the British reason for having the canal was to maintain their colonies in India, right? Access to the Empress of the jewel in the crown, India, and somewhat analogous to America needing access to Atlantic Pacific, to its new colonies in the Pacific. Guam and the Philippines, I should have mentioned. Guam is another new American colony from the Spanish-American War. Also note that when the project finished at the dawn of World War I, it's completely appropriate that America is focused here on its backyard, because that is really where they've decided they want to limit their world involvement. Right? So that's a segue to isolationism and how America gets into World War I. Now, importantly, that isolationism is not complete, and it does not extend to diplomacy. In fact, under Roosevelt, America becomes a major player in global diplomacy, and Roosevelt is recognized for that when he's a peace broker in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 and gets a Nobel Prize for that. Fascinating war. It's the first time in modern times that a European nation has been defeated by an Asian one. Hugely humiliating for the Russians. The Tsarist government, it's on its hind legs, or back legs, or it's on its heels. I say that too often, but in any case, they are. And it leads directly to the 1905 revolution in Russia, which is a forerunner for the more successful, ultimately successful 1917 revolution. But it matters. America is now being drawn into global diplomacy, and especially it matters in this region because, and this is why I'm telling you this now, for World War II. Later in the course, we'll talk about how America is positioning itself eventually as an enemy against Japan and defender of China as we head towards World War II. But for now, know that America is becoming that kind of that policeman of the world, that regional power broker. But to get back to my earlier point, we're heading into World War I. And Americans have no interest in joining that war. They are, you could term it hemispheric isolationists, right? It's the Western Hemisphere's the images of a fireproof house. And there's a great cartoon here from 1914. This is the popular image. It's called The Great Wall. So akin to the Chinese, America's keeping the barbarians out with all their problems. Yeah, so they see what's happening as we head to World War I as really Europe's problem. And they're quite right in that. And they see it as a failure in their diplomacy. And they're quite right in that as well. And we don't want to get too deep into World War I. In fact, America's involvement here was all of 1 year. But its real importance is in breaking a gridlock here in a war of attrition, and its role as peacemaker, the legacy of America as peacemaker after the war. Enough to say that without American involvement, the Allies and the Entente were fairly evenly matched, and hence this long bloodbath. And the best evidence of that really is the 4-year, 400-mile stalemate known as the Western Front, where we have the Battle of the Somme, Verdun, Vipers, all those major battles where 5 million young men are buried. Now, it's important to note that a couple things do it for the Entente, the British and the French in the end, and partly it's tank warfare. The Tanks Committee, of which Churchill was a part, the Landships Committee, as they called it, and those do make a massive difference. The Germans are behind on that, and everyone will be studying the lessons of tank warfare after World War I. But it's also more so the fact that the U.S. enters the war in April 1917. And why did they do that? Wilson, the president, had promised not to. In fact, his election slogan in 1916 was, "He kept us out of war." So his re-election slogan, "He kept us out of war." And another slogan for that year, 1916, "America first." So not real nuanced, right? People voting for him are expecting that this will obtain, that there will be no war in Europe. He will not order a draft. So why? Why does America get involved here, and why does Wilson change his mind? And it's kind of the same way that isolationism breaks down in World War II. In fact, the U.S. is already at war to some extent, because you cannot be a fireproof house in a more interconnected world. And we see that, again, as with World War II, America needs to protect its own shipping from German U-boats, from the German U-boat menace. Yes, they're using them already in World War I. In fact, they take out 5,000 ships, the German undersea boats, in World War I. One of those really upsets the Americans and helps whet appetite for getting into the war, and that's the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania is a blue ribbon holder for the fastest Atlantic crossing. It's a big ship. It's one of the biggest, and it's heading from New York to England, gets hit by a U-boat, and of the 2,000 people on board, 1,200 are killed. So it's a tragic disaster. And included in that list are 128 Americans. And more importantly, these are prominent Americans, including Alfred Vanderbilt of the famous Vanderbilt families. Incidentally, too, James Dunsmuir Jr. Of Vancouver Island's Dunsmuir family is killed also in this sinking. And it's an indication of the wealth and the status of those who are on board. Now, Americans, like anyone, are outraged, but that's one thing, and it's always given in tandem with this other cause that gets more Americans willing to go to war, and that is the Zimmermann telegram. Right, this is where Germany invites Mexico to join them in the war by attacking the U.S. and promising the most amazing things. Quote in the telegram, quote, we make Mexico a proposal or alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Yeah, this is intercepted by the British, who then feed it to the Americans, and yeah, there's a few Americans, not uh, including obviously some Texans, who would take major issue with this and do. And long story short, General Pershing's American boys assemble in France, and by 1918 they're finally mobilized. 2 million of them, with 3 million more ready to go. And this really is the critical manpower edge that the Western powers need at this point to push back the Ludendorff offensive, which got the Germans within shelling range of Paris. But it's also more than that, so we shouldn't overstate it. It's also the fact that Canucks and the Anzacs are finally breaking the Western Front that summer and pushing Germans into Belgium. But again, it can't be separated from the fact that the Americans are taking pressure off the front as well. But it's also things like, really importantly, it's the fact that Germany is completely spent in 1918, not only in manpower, but also the success of the English sea blockade, which sees very successful. It sees that Germany blockaded from access to the Atlantic, other than U-boats, and German civilians, because of that, starting to starve. Actually, many thousands of them, and war production is cut in half in Germany by 1918. It's also the fact that Austria-Hungary collapses in on itself, so one of their big allies is gone by late summer 1918. Finally, it's mutiny on the German home front, first by sailors, and then that spreads into cities in protests that are known as the German Revolution of 1918, or the November Revolution, these early November uprisings. Now, all of this really matters, and I'm telling you that because the myth that forms in Germany after the war is that Germany 100% did not lose, that it was simply weak-kneed politicians in the home front who were mainly Jewish and communists. And this is what's called the stab in the back myth, the stab in the back myth. Right? Also, im Feld unbesiegt, in the field undefeated, becomes the motto of the German army after World War I, that they had left the field undefeated and marched back to intact cities, and that politicians in the home front had stabbed them in the back. But yeah, it is also massively important that big numbers of American youth and huge numbers in terms of resources and equipment starts pouring into Europe at an absolutely pivotal point in the field in spring 1918. And it's enough so, American involvement is so important that Wilson is effectively the man of the hour come 1919 when peace terms are being discussed. And not to belabor this also, but really the only important people here that matter are Wilson, Clemenceau of France, and Lloyd George of England. And they set the terms at what becomes a 6-month-long Versailles Treaty negotiations. The first time an American sitting president has left office for Europe while in office. And he doesn't just stay for a week, he's there for a long time. And of those three, it's really Wilson that they defer to as the natural leader and the only idealist among the three, and also the only one who is financially viable at that point. Wilson wants an American peace, the same 14 points that he took Americans into war with. And these are pretty predictable from an American perspective anyway. Freedom of the seas is one of them. Transparent treaty making, so no more secret alliances. That's a wise one, which a really big part of what had caused the war. A key article, though, is point 14, and that was a League of Nations, a new organization that would prevent future wars by guaranteeing the territorial independence of each nation. Great idea, does form, but then as it turns out, Americans don't end up joining Wilson's League, incredibly. And it's kind of a story of dueling egos, both of which have Ivy League PhDs, and that's Woodrow Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge is the Senate leader, and he wants adjustments to Article 10. He fears that America will get dragged into another war through this collective security agreement, which is entirely possible. Wilson won't budge in having any adjustments to what he hammered out at Versailles in terms of the League, and it doesn't help either that he can't stand Lodge, and Lodge detest Wilson. So they have a personal animosity towards each other. Then it doesn't help that Wilson has a stroke. In any case, things get out and out ugly. The treaty doesn't get the votes it needs to pass the Senate, and America never does join the League of Nations. Which means, of course, that America will not be part of this brave new world that Wilson had created, or crafted, sorry, and had hoped for. But Europe will be. But the story isn't over for America's involvement. In spite of this return to isolationism, which is what we're getting now, America still needs to play a role here. And specifically, it's needed to rescue Germany when it has a bit of an inflation problem, as you might have heard. Now, the myth is that this is caused by the reparations that it has to pay its former enemies, right, which were unfair. It's actually caused by these chronic strikes by Germans who are upset at the Versailles Treaty and its own government's stupid decision to pay striking workers by printing more money. So this is really the cause of it. Now, the solution for it is this. It's no more complex than a crayon drawing, but here it is. The Americans lend Germany the money to pay its war debts to France, who then pays back Americans for their wartime loans, and that's called the Dawes Plan. Later gets extended into what's called the Young Plan. Simple as that. Meantime, and perhaps more importantly, Americans are starting to feel in the 1920s that they were, as early as 1919 already, that they were duped into this war. With the propaganda about the evil Germans, and forgetting the nasty telegram, the Zimmerman telegram, which they do, right? They start to think thoughtful thoughts about what it is that makes nations go to war, and it turns out follow the money. Right, when we get this talk of the daddy war bucks, the merchants of death, and that munitions manufacturers get blamed because they made a whole lot of money from the war, and we're pro-war essentially, right? So a congressional committee is struck to investigate, and 100% blames the daddy war bucks phenom for this war. Well, not 100%, it's other things as well, but it does blame them. American manufacturers stood to make, and then did make, a lot of dough and had pushed for war. Banks had also made big loans to Western allies, London and elsewhere. They needed them to win in order to get that money back. So, and it's called the Nye Committee hearing. That's Senator Nye, and he blames them too, banks and American corporations. So the influence of finance and corporate America, that's nothing to sneeze at. Basically, when war is profitable, you will see more of it. And so we get from that what are called the Neutrality Acts Congress passes after the Nye Commission reports on what brought America into this war that is massively unpopular after it's over. And the Neutrality Acts are quite simple. It means no trading allowed and no money lending with a foreign belligerent. So anyone engaged in war, or what could drag America into war, any belligerent in Europe. So if we keep our hands out of the European pie, we won't have to pay ultimately the piper. No, that doesn't make sense. So just keep our hands out of the European pie. But what constitutes a belligerent is unclear. In any case, this is American foreign policy, 1898 to 1930s. That is it. End of lecture. Imperialism under the banner of extending freedom. Very old American propaganda, so not new there, historicized for you. Also a point that sometimes that benevolent assimilation can actually be beneficial. More often, though, it's really rationalization for supporting whatever regime that is friendly, that supports American corporate control. We also saw a growing role as power broker for America, especially in the Pacific. And after World War I, this studied return to isolationism. Okay, thanks for listening. That's it for this lecture. If you have any questions, let me know.